Greetings, everyone. My name is Jim Lowe, and this is a presentation on collecting items from the World War II homefront period. I originally did this presentation for the American Political Items Collectors at their National Convention in Seven Springs. I'm doing this presentation for the Wichita Postcard Club collectors, and I've added some items to it to enhance the presentation specifically for them. So let's go ahead and get started with a little bit of introduction to me and to what homefront is. I spent 34 years teaching high school history, and I really enjoyed using artifacts in the classroom. And that's really how I got started collecting items from the home front. And it really was spurred on by this book by Stan Cohen, which came out in 1990. And its title is seen there on the screen, V for Victory. And it provides an in-depth look at all the things done on the home front during the Second World War. A lot of people are familiar with the actual fighting during the war, the fighting in Europe, the fighting in the Pacific, the China-Burma India theater, but not everyone is familiar with the actions taken on the home front. And I think it's such a remarkable story and a fascinating area to collect. So with that being said, I've spent the last 34 years, as I mentioned, in the classroom. And during that time, I was honored to be Pennsylvania's History Teacher of the Year by Goodell Lehrman and received several other awards. And a lot of those were credited to the fact that I used artifacts to help teach American history. In collecting those artifacts, one of the things I wanted to do is write some books, and that's what I've been doing since I retired. And here's the latest one I've worked on. It's titled Kick 'em in the Axis. And one of the aspects of collecting Homefront is the anti-axis collectibles, things that were made to denigrate, make fun of the enemy, or just simply expose the enemy for what they were, the awful countries that they were during the war. This book has 1,000 items in color photographs, all in glossy pages, about 24 chapters of items in different categories, and it's available for $35 plus shipping. And the email address, if you'd like to order it, it's not available in stores. It's only available directly from me, is there at the top of the screen. And I'll go over this again at the end of the presentation. For those of you that, after you see this section on anti-axis, you might actually be interested enough to order that. So with that being said, let's go ahead and get started with the simple question of what is the home front? And typically in American history textbooks, the home front, when I first started teaching, was relegated to a page. It's now a section of its own, but it really could be an entire chapter. There's so much to talk about here, but I've tried to condense it, to the 6 topics that are on the screen that you can see there. The campaign to win the war at home is divided into these areas: paying for the war, constructing materials to fight the war, conserving materials needed for the war, supporting those fighting the war, protecting those at home from attack, and finally, motivating citizens to support the war effort. On the right side of the screen, I think, is a poster made by the U.S. government, their OWI, Office of War Information. And this poster, I really think, epitomizes the efforts at home to win the war. Now, folks today sometimes like those simple graphic messages, and I did some searching on the home front, and I came up with this simple graphic image on the internet that shows 4 terms of how people were supporting the war effort at home: shut up, produce, sacrifice, and hate. And of course, it has those 2 terms on the bookends there: shut up, which is, an offensive term in a sense, but really during the war, that was the point. Keep your mouth shut about military secrets. And on the other bookend, the term hate, when you're in a war, it doesn't take a whole lot of effort to grow to hate the enemy when your loved ones and your neighbors and your friends are off fighting a war and coming home injured, and sometimes coming home killed from the war. So that happens. And that, of course, spurs people on then to produce and make sacrifices during the war at home. Now, when you're collecting home front, I divided this chart up so it makes it a little bit easier for somebody that hasn't collected the area of home front at all. And the first thing you would have to consider is what war. So if you're collecting World War II, you can collect World War I home front. There's some items from the Spanish-American War, even some items from the American Civil War. There are items from the Korean War, from the Vietnam War, and even from the recent war. So you can look at which home front effort you actually want to focus on. I think World War II is the ultimate example of collecting home front because of the length of the war and the massive effort undertaken by those at home. Now, once you've selected a war, and this presentation is going to focus on World War II, by the way, Once you've selected a war, you can then look at types of items you wish to collect. Buttons, pins, posters. Some of you watching this, I imagine, are postcard collectors and even 3D items. Then I have this category at the bottom, artifacts. And you might think, well, isn't every historic item an artifact? That's what I took pride on using in my history classes. But in this sense, the artifacts are items actually used to implement what was being done on the home front. So not necessarily a button that might say buy war bonds or a poster like the one I just showed you, but an actual war bond. And I'll give you some examples of other artifacts here in a moment. There are also the themes. Now, the themes that I picked on the right side of the screen there are themes from World War II. You would change those themes if you were collecting from another war. We have V for victory, buying war bonds, anti-axis, which is what my books focuses on, and remember Pearl Harbor among those. One final question on the far right side is, do you wish to collect just American items, or do you want to collect items maybe made in Great Britain or in Canada or some of our other allies? And that's a question for the individual collector based upon your tastes. Now, a moment ago, I just mentioned that category of artifacts. And if you're interested in artifacts, I think this is a fascinating area of Homefront and one that I really liked using with my students in class are items created actually used during the war, not advertising, not message creators, but items actually used. And you see here some victory gloves used by both men and women. The gloves on the right represent workers' gloves for women. You see the blackout light at the bottom of the screen there used during blackout drills, a rationing book, and I'll talk about rationing a little bit later in the presentation. The savings book for defense stamps, and I'll talk about those as well. And one of the really curious items, I think, is there on the bottom left, that $1 bill that's stamped with the word Hawaii. After the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, there was a lot of fear that the Japanese might follow that up with an invasion. So the U.S. government overstamped all the currency in Hawaii with the word Hawaii, so that if the Japanese invaded the islands and they captured a large amount of American currency, they couldn't take that to the international market and spend it on weapons. A really smart move by the Americans, and thank goodness that was never something we had to implement and say that all currency imprinted with the word Hawaii is now void. So what I did for this presentation is I took some of the major areas of collecting Homefront and provided you with some examples of items that you might collect in that area. And the first one, and probably among the most well-known, is Remember Pearl Harbor. You see on the screen here some items that were popular during the war. And really, if they could put the words Remember Pearl Harbor on it, they did it. Whether it's the necktie that's on the far right side of the screen or the pin back buttons on the screen on the left and on the right side, the poster that shows the enemy leaders as snakes, the punch board in the middle, even the chalkware item that's on the far left side of the screen that shows the USS Arizona, the ship that was destroyed when the Japanese aerial bomb entered the powder magazine and basically destroyed the ship, killing over 1,000 men on that ship alone. These items were used to spur Americans on in their patriotic effort. And it was successful. And I'll give you a couple examples of that. Albert Maines, a World War I pilot, actually was so motivated by the Remember Pearl Harbor effort that he telegraphed the White House and said he was willing to pilot an airplane to wherever the Japanese ships were hiding after the attack and crash the airplane right into their ships. Another fellow in Washington, he was so angered by the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, he went out and started chopping down the cherry blossom trees surrounding the tidal basin. Nobody stopped him until he ran out of energy after he got through 4 trees. So there was a lot of effort like this throughout the country to remind folks about the dastardly attack on December 7th and use that as a motivating factor almost for all the other items that you'll see here in today's presentation. One item that I'll note here, or actually two, that I think are very fascinating. The button at the top that's a wooden button. During the war, there were shortages of metal, so they started to make do with whatever they had on hand. And the wooden button at the top that just says, Remember Pearl Harbor, was made during the war. And right below that, that button that's a globe with an airplane and metal streamers from it was made by the Honolulu Chamber of Commerce to raise money to help Honolulu rebuild. Now, you might be thinking, well, I thought they attacked Pearl Harbor, not Honolulu. That is correct. However, if you know where Honolulu is compared to Pearl Harbor, By the time the second wave hit Pearl Harbor, all the artillery shells that we were shooting at the Japanese planes had to come down somewhere, and many of them fell on Honolulu, causing a lot of damage to the city. So people bought that pin, and the proceeds from buying that went to the city of Honolulu. One thing I did for this presentation that's a little different from the presentation I did at Seven Springs for the American Political Items collectors is I added postcards in each area. Now, there are a lot of postcards made on some of these themes, but I chose some postcards that I particularly like. And this particular postcard, and you see on the right side of the screen, I have information about the publisher when it's available. I really like this one because it's reminiscent of the postcards and images, I should say, that were made during the Spanish-American War. After the sinking of the USS Maine, there was a lot of emphasis on we want revenge for that, and we'll give you a little something to remember the Maine. Well, this is a similar image, but made during World War II for we'll give you something to remember Pearl Harbor. So that's the reason I like that particular postcard. Also, for each item, I have a spotlight item that's just, I think, a really top-notch item. And a lot of these are scarce, even rare, hard items to find. And I think this one's neat because it combines three different collector themes here. It combines the idea of Remember Pearl Harbor, the idea of an anti-Axis image there with the bayonet impaling the three enemy leaders during the war. And it also includes a quote from FDR. So there's some appeal there for collectors of all those different areas. My next category, and some people really like to focus on this, is collecting items from the years 1939 until 1941. What was the U.S. doing while the war was going on? People weren't quite yet involved. And I'll kind of take you through this page in sort of a counterclockwise manner. So I'm going to start on the left, bottom left, and you see America First there. America First was an organization with about 850,000 members, and their focus was to build up American defense. We should focus on defending the United States, but not helping other countries. And they had some significant members of their organization. Henry Ford was a member. Charles Lindbergh was an outspoken member. But they've received some negative press also because they were infiltrated by people that were pro-German, pro-Nazi, because they thought, well, let the U.S. spend money on them, but not help the enemies of Nazi Germany. Now, there were also Americans that thought the best way to handle keeping out of the war is to boycott goods made in both Nazi Germany and Japan. So you see some items from that at the top. Then there are those that wanted to help the Allies. Let's help the Allies, and that was the best way to keep us out of the war. That's that license plate topper in the top left corner of your screen. And then you see some other items about no convoys that'll keep us out of war, remembering what happened during World War I. And then, of course, Americans with their good heart, that's a long tradition of American people to try and help others. You see a lot of organizations were created to help countries that were victimized by the Axis powers. The bottom of the screen, that parachute represents the largest of those relief organizations. That's the Russian War Relief. And of course, it turns out after the war, they were using that organization, they being the Russians, to send communist agents into the United States to spy on what our country was doing. So a negative side to that one as well. You see some other ones there, like the aid button for Czechoslovakia. There was really an organization to aid just about every country that was victimized by the Axis. The largest of those was the Bundles for Britain organization in the bottom right. They had over 1 million members, and they started as a simple organization to knit sweaters for people in Britain and expanded to a variety of donations for purchasing ambulances and medical supplies, really an active organization throughout the war. Some of these organizations actually continued through the end of the war, especially the relief organizations, but America First disappeared as soon as Pearl Harbor was attacked. Finding postcards for these organizations is really tough. So I had to pull out this one, and I don't know how much interest this would be to a postcard collector, because on the front of it's just a generic postcard about telephones, but they turned it into a USO War Relief postcard. So USO War Relief provided funds not only to American soldiers, but also to these aid organizations throughout the war. But I always thought this was fascinating because it was the ingenuity of the war effort at the time. My marquee item for this particular collection area is a license plate topper to keep America out of war. because that was the prevailing thought at the time. Whether you wanted to boycott products or not have convoys or build up American defense or help the British, all those organizations shared one thought, and that was to keep us out of the war. That, of course, all changed on December 7th, 1941. The next topic, and probably the easiest of homefront areas to collect, just because of the massive number of goods that were created, were those related to paying for the war. This war will cost more money than our government spent in every presidential administration from Washington through the first 8 years of Franklin Roosevelt's term as president. That's how expensive this war will be. Just an incredible amount of money is required to fight World War II. And 60% of that money will come from the sales of war bonds. And you see there pictured on the screens an actual war bond, which I classified earlier as an artifact, but it goes well with collecting items from this area. And then if you couldn't afford a $25 war bond, which would cost you $18.75, you could buy that in stamps and purchase a smaller stamp, a quarter, 50 cents, $1, until you saved up enough to turn those in for a war bond. The other 40% is going to be paid for with taxes, and it's going to be a major government effort. Now, there aren't as many items for taxes. You see the license plate topper there, and it's convenient that taxes rhymes with axis for that license plate topper, so it makes a catchy little phrase. But you don't see much on taxes. Obviously, there's no difference then between how people felt then and how people felt today. They don't like taxes, but it became a necessity during the war to promote them. Even Disney got in on it with making a cartoon called The Spirit of 43, which I think is a fascinating cartoon. It has a patriotic message and patriotic music, and it's all about your money can buy planes to destroy the Axis with your taxes. And honestly, the first time I watched it at the end, I felt like reaching for my wallet to pay my taxes because it's such a motivating force. But that's an interesting cartoon from 1943 to check out, The Spirit of 43, made by Walt Disney. War bond sales, surprisingly, maybe some not, lagged at different times during the war. So the government created 8 major war loan drives to promote buying those war bonds. And I'll talk about those in a moment, but I want to divide this into 2 categories for collecting. The first are items related to buying war bonds and stamps. And honestly speaking, you could find the message buy war bonds and stamps on just about everything. If they could print it, they stamped it on there. Every newspaper, every magazine, sheet music, it's everywhere. It really was a message that they were trying to get to everyone to help pay for this incredibly expensive war in monetary terms. So you see on the screen here some items, a couple of pinback buttons, the bank on the bottom left so people could save up their own money. The poster in the center, I really like that poster. It gets a little bit of the guilt factor in there with they're fighting harder than ever. Are you buying more war bonds than ever? And then the item in the top right is actually a song written for school students, encouraging them to buy war bonds. And I think a great example of that is my own hometown. I'm from Pennsylvania, and the town here that I live in, the schools all had a competition, monthly competition, as to which school bought the most bonds. And one of the schools here, a young lady came in, received the handout from the teacher on here's the next bond drive, went home to her father and said, "Dad, I want to purchase a real war bond, not one of those $25 ones, not a $100 bond, not a $200 bond. I want to purchase a $5,000 bond." And remarkably, her dad agreed. And I can't imagine handing an elementary student $3,800 some dollars to go in and buy a $5,000 bond, but that's indeed what he did. And that gives you an idea of the level of motivation here. But they pulled out all the stops on buying war bonds. There were auctions. Jack Benny donated his violin. It sold for over $1 million. That's in 1940s money to buy war bonds. Other items were donated, letters written by George Washington, a Thomas Jefferson Bible. Even the famous burlesque dancer, Gypsy Rose Lee, volunteered to dance at Fort Benning. And she offered to place war bonds all over her person and remove them based upon those that were willing to pay that price for that particular war bond. The military had so many requests for folks to transfer to Fort Benning just to see this promotion that it leaked out to the public and they had to cancel it. But I think that's a great story about how much effort went into getting people to buy war bonds and stamps. As I had mentioned on the previous screen, the United States conducted 8 war loans. These were specific periods of time, usually 3 to 5 weeks, where they really pushed people to buy war bonds. The first war loan, you never see any collectibles from that because it was targeted to investment bankers and they just didn't buy into it. It fell miserably short of their goal. So by the second war loan, you start to see items appear for that because they targeted that to the citizens. They realized that would be a better objective. And by the third war loan, which you see the poster in the center of the screen, from the third war loan, they really focused on citizens. And from the third war loan on through the 8th, which took place after the war ended, they set goals for every county in the country as well as every major city. For example, the city I'm from had a population of about 42,000 during the war. And they set a goal for my city to sell $4 million worth of war bonds in a 3.5-week period. And every single goal that was given to my city and my county were met, and they exceeded them. So quite remarkable for both my area and many of the areas around the country. So you see quite a few items from the war loan. These are a little bit tougher to find because they were only issued for that brief 3 to 5 week period. But on the other hand, they're not really too hard to find because the government was printing these in large quantities. You see here on the screen an example of how many items were made related to buying war bonds. And as I mentioned, this is a very popular area, but I'm going to give you some hints on how to identify time periods for war bonds in terms of pins. You'll see a pin there on the left side of the screen that says defense bonds. If you see that term, that's a pin that was made prior to the attack on Pearl Harbor. Our government started selling bonds to raise money to pay for the war or pay for our defense, as it was known, as defense bonds, even before the attack on Pearl Harbor. Once we entered the war, they switched the name to war bonds. If you see the term Liberty bonds, that's an item from World War I. They used a kinder term during World War I using Liberty bonds instead of war bonds. And then finally, sometimes you see items that say victory bonds. Now, that was the term used for the 8th war loan. But more often than not, if you see victory bonds, that's a Canadian item. A lot of those, of course, in collectors' hands, made their way across the border into the United States. So typically you see victory bonds, that's a Canadian item, unless it specifically may say made in the US. So just some suggestions on looking for these items. When I use this postcard in class, I always like to remind my students that your generation is not the one that came up with the idea of using a funny picture with a saying known as memes that they like to have on the internet. Here's one of Owen Murphy Jr., a good Irish name from World War II, used to conduct a war bond campaign through the theaters in which you would purchase a war bond. And I think that's just a great image. And on the back, it tells you the story of there about Owen Murphy Jr., his war bond campaign. And that I'd say adorable picture, but I don't think everyone would agree with that. But my spotlight item here, I just think these images by Norman Rockwell are fantastic. These are based upon the Four Freedoms Declaration by Franklin Roosevelt in 1941, and really an idea of how the campaign effort was, for the most part, wholesome. In fact, the only complaints the government ever received during the war about buying war bonds were really twofold. First, some people complained that, look, stop all the advertising. We're going to buy war bonds. You don't have to hit us with all these posters and signs and messages on the radio and on newspapers. We'll buy them. The other complaints they received, kind of the opposite of wholesome, sometimes for war bond rallies, especially when they had maybe a famous actress there to help promote the war bond rally, she might give a kiss away to those that are buying war bond or things like that. There were some folks that complained about that was below the moral standards of the United States. But for the most part, Americans were wholesale on board with the war bond drive during the war. And as I mentioned, it paid for 60% of the war. Another popular area to collect is production. The production that took place during World War II is what ultimately helps in the Great Depression that was really damaging the United States, not only the economy, but just the people in general during the 1930s. So once the war started, not only did we have 15 million men in uniform, men and women, I should say, we also had everybody going to work. In fact, it gave opportunities for workers that typically wouldn't get hired. Women were given jobs, minorities were given jobs, people with some disabilities that were often overlooked. For example, hearing impaired workers were hired to work in metal facilities where there's a lot of hammering and pounding, where it wouldn't bother them as much. Folks that couldn't read were hired to be garbage collectors by the government. I'm not sure how you advertise for that, but they were hired because they wanted people collecting the garbage that wouldn't see any secrets that were in the garbage. I know specifically they did that for the Manhattan Project. And then even those with mental illnesses, which might be shunned, were given jobs during the war. One woman worked in a defense factory who insisted she was Queen Elizabeth, and she would gladly work as Queen Elizabeth as long as you referred to her as your Royal Highness. And she was reported to be the best worker in the factory. So I always think that's important to point out that this really opened up opportunities for groups that before didn't have a chance to work. Now, on the screen here, you see various items related to those working, either attracting workers or letting folks know, hey, there's a war worker sleeping here. Shh, you want to be quiet so they get their rest so they can contribute to the war effort. It was very important, especially for men, if you were still at home with all the other men heading off to fight the war, that folks knew that you were helping with the war industry. You weren't just avoiding service in the military. So you see a lot of pins and that banner that's in the top left about people saying, listen, I serve, but it's in the industry for the war effort, not in uniform. If you look at this collecting area, one of the areas that sometimes people like to specialize in are the items actually worn by employees. On the top there, you see what's called the E Award. The E Award was actually started by President Theodore Roosevelt when he wanted to increase the size of the U.S. Navy during his presidency with the Great White Fleet. And he created this award to give workers that were helping successfully to build the Navy. They reinvented this award during World War II as the E-Production Award. And the one you see on the top left there is a Navy award. And the one you see in the center middle that has the stripes is the Army Navy Award once they decided to have both. And some factories were very proud of receiving this. So they made their own badges, which is what you see on the top right there. Only 5% of the companies in the United States actually earned the E Award, which E stands for efficiency. They had to prove that they didn't waste materials. They kept their workers happy. They were efficient in producing materials for the war effort. Really an interesting side collection there for those folks that like to collect those E items. There's also those that like to collect the workers' badges, which is the item seen in the bottom in the middle. And there's a lot of other pins that war workers would wear. Not all of them fancy or attractive as some of the other items I'm going to show you are, but really they played a major role in helping to win the war by what they were doing in the factories. The postcard I chose for this has the V for Victory symbol, and this is from a 10-card set from the Victory series. And I thought this was a great example showing not only the victory effort is brought about by those in the military, which you see pictured there on the postcard, but also by the factory worker at home helping to push that V over the top. The spotlight item here is one that I think everyone will recognize. This poster by J. Howard Miller was displayed in the Westinghouse factory in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania for about 2 weeks. And most of you would recognize this as Rosie the Riveter. In fact, this image has been used over and over again for many different campaigns for women's rights, for female political candidates, for women in general, as a message we can do it. But I want to point out to you that nowhere on that poster does it say Rosie the Riveter. In fact, if I just showed that image to folks during World War II, they wouldn't have recognized it. Unlike today, where everyone would say, you know, that image is ubiquitous and everyone's seen it. The only poster of that's original is held by the Smithsonian. And they helped make that poster very popular by printing that image on coffee cups and T-shirts and things and selling it in their gift shop. But really, for a World War II person, the idea of Rosie the Riveter didn't come about because once these posters were taken down, they were all thrown away. By the way, if you ever see one of those and it's an original, my goodness, buy it. You'll owe me a commission for that because you'll make a lot of money on it. People got to know the term Rosie the Riveter from a 1942 song titled Rosie the Riveter. There are actually about 6 women that have come forward over the years to say, I am the Rosie that song is based upon. My favorite one of the 6 is Rosina Bonavita from California, who remarkably was in newspapers across the country because in a 6-hour work shift, and they often had women work 6-hour shifts instead of longer because they didn't think the women could work as well as the men, but that's a story for another day. But in a 6-hour shift, she drove 3,300 rivets. And that's a remarkable amount of work for anyone, man or woman. So she's the one I like to imagine that the Rosie the Riveter is based upon. But really, we don't know. The song doesn't indicate who it was really named for. Now, the image that folks would have known during World War II is this image. And that's a Norman Rockwell image. And that character there that he has on the cover looks like someone that could drive 3,300 rivets in 6 hours. So that, again, is more the image that people knew during World War II as Rosie the Riveter. Myself, being from a railroad town, my favorite female worker poster is this one. You see that there in the bottom right corner of your screen, which represents a woman working on a train in the freight yards of the Pennsylvania Railroad. You'll also notice in the bottom right, there is the message of buy war bonds. As I mentioned, it was everywhere. Of the actions on the home front, this is the only one that people did not like. People pitched into all the others without complaints, but that's not going to be the case here. The Office of Price Administration was created to ration and set price limits on American goods and products. The first item that was rationed, that required a stamp for you to purchase, were tires. That was followed quickly by sugar, and then a variety of other products, usually items made of metal, including canned goods. Meat was rationed, coffee was rationed. They stopped making cars. You know, if you're a car collector, you won't see any cars from 1942 or 43 or 44 or 45. They started making domestic passenger cars again once the war was over. So the government had strict controls on goods that were needed for the war effort, and this was the only one that was not popular. Now, there are a lot of collectibles related to these items, and I'm going to point some of them out. On the top left corner of the screen there, you see the ration books, and you see those all the time in antique stores, on eBay, because everyone saved them. Even if they used the last stamp in the book, they still saved them because they were worried the government would say to get the next book, you're going to have to turn in your old one. So everyone kept them. So that's a very popular item and not something that's particularly valuable unless you find one that's belonged to somebody famous. I know the Franklin Roosevelt Library in New York actually has his ration book from the war. If you find one from somebody famous, that's a whole different story. Bottom left corner of the screen, it's one of my favorite OPA, Office of Price Administration items to collect. Those are gasoline ration stamps. Everybody that was asked for gasoline ration stamps was first allotted 4 gallons a week. Then they lowered that to 3 and then 2. That's the average consumer that had a car was allowed an A stamp, which allowed them those amounts of gas. If you need a little bit extra, you could get a B supplemental gas ration stamp also. There were also a C, which you see on the screen there. There's a D, which is for motorcycles. There's an M for highway maintenance trucks. There's an E for emergency vehicles. And no surprise, there was an X. Now, the X was intended to be for unlimited gasoline. You wouldn't be restricted at all in the amount of gasoline you bought. But they did away with the X sticker when they realized that over 200 members of Congress had secured X stickers and were using them for their own benefit instead of for appropriate military use. So not a surprise that members of Congress were pulling something like that. On the bottom right side, you see that yellow square there. Once they issued stamps and point values, which you see in the middle of the screen there, the blue ones that say 8, 5, 2, and 1, I'll give you an idea how they would work. The blue ones were for metalled canned goods. So if you went into the store and wanted to buy a can of grapefruit juice, that might cost you 16 points. The only thing is, all you have is an 8, 5, and 2, and you don't have enough points. So then you could look at your change. You would get out a couple of those blue little tokens and then use those to amount to your 17 points. Also, if you were buying something, let's say, that was 15 points, but you only had 2 8 points left, you would purchase it, and then you would receive one of those blue tokens back. And you need the tokens or stamps, as well as you would need the money to purchase the item. The other thing the Office of Price Administration did that was not very popular is set maximum price levels. You see the item on the right side of the screen there is the ceiling prices for beer. And you see they set, some people are very happy with this today, maximum price for a lot of 12-ounce bottles of beer at 15 or 20 cents. So again, something that was maybe popular for consumers, but not so much for those that were selling the items. I mentioned that rationing was the only home front activity that people really objected to. And I'll give you an example using this postcard here of a man with sleeping with his arm over some tires, and he's got a shotgun there and a knife in his hand. The U.S. government issued an order because tires were short in terms of supply because of the war, that every individual owning a car could only have 5 tires, the 4 on the car and 1 spare. Any other tires you had to, get ready for this, give back to the government. So this postcard here is making fun of that factor a little bit, maybe a little serious about the man protecting his tires, not wanting to give those up. If you did happen to have, let's say, a complete blowout, you needed another tire, you actually had to fill out a form and apply to your local ration board to get that. And they printed your name in the paper. So you want to be a person who appeared in the paper all the time for getting an extra pair of tires. And they did that for other products too that were rubber, like shoes. Seen here for my spotlight item for rationing is War Ration Book number 5. The U.S. government only issued 4 ration books during the war, but they had a 5th book printed for use in 1945 after the invasion of Japan. Of course, that wasn't needed because of the use of the 2 atomic bombs. However, some of the books ended up in educational kits sent out to libraries. And in this case, I was able to obtain one, but they are very hard to find. So if you come across one of these, it's unlike books 1 through 4. These are really difficult to find. The government destroyed most of them. World War II was really the first effort across the country to have recycling. So under the category of scrap and salvage campaigns, they were looking for citizens to turn in everything. And this is one that everyone really pitched in, because they could go into their basement, into their barn, into their garage, into the shed out back and look for items they no longer needed and contribute them to the war effort, whether it was metal, whether it was glass, whether it was rags, whether it was paper, whether it was books to be sent to soldiers for them to read overseas. Even milk pods were saved to make life preservers. Even kitchen fat was saved to make glycerol for bombs. So really, there's a massive effort here, and this is one that everybody pitched into. You see here on the screen some examples of that from paper collections, from tin collections, aluminum collections. At the bottom, there's a poster there for a hanger collection. Everyone really enjoyed this one because, unlike buying war bonds, it didn't require any money. It just helped you to get rid of the things you didn't really want in the first place. At the same time, you contributed to the war effort. The only negative about this I'll mention, and it's kind of sad, we saw this happen here in our own community in several parks, a lot of antiques and relics of value, some Civil War cannons, for example, here locally, were taken down out of parks and sent to be melted down and used for the war effort. So the loss of some historic artifacts, I would say, is a negative, but people didn't have a problem doing it because they saw it as a war for the survival of democracy. I picked a real photo postcard for this one. Here's a high school in Wisconsin who the students, and this was a really popular activity for students, to collect scrap and carry it to school. This school did such a wonderful job in doing that they had to pile it up outside of the school, which you see in this postcard. And I think that's just a fantastic example of folks contributing to the war effort. And they weren't the only ones. Here's a collection of scrap material that was done at my high school. And at least they had a sense of humor. I hope the principal had a sense of humor because the students brought it into school and stacked it in his office. Coincidentally, he was away at a conference learning about how schools can help with the war effort. So they decided to stack it in his office. And certainly something you wouldn't see today. One of the students carried into school a World War I machine gun captured from the Germans and brought back by his uncle. You can only imagine the panic if somebody carried a machine gun, even a World War I machine gun, into a school today. Now, it wasn't just schools doing the I'm going to get in on the effort. Here's a fellow that many of you may recognize. Yes, indeed, that is Walt Disney, about to take a sledgehammer to, some people call this the Bambi statue. I think he had the statues before Bambi came out in 1942, but I guess we can call it the Bambi statue. He's going to smash that statue up and break it up into pieces, and they're going to load it up and haul it off to be made into a 75 millimeter gun. There was enough metal there to make that artillery piece. My spotlight item here, a lot of the items from scrap drives are unique items made in each hometown. And here's one with the phrase, scrap the Jap tin drive. Now, the way Axis rhymed with Taxis, it was kind of convenient that scrap rhymed with Jap. Now, we know today that that's not an appropriate term to use, certainly not politically correct, but during World War II, in this fight for democracy, political correctness was not something on people's minds. So you kind of have to keep that in mind when you look at items from the war effort, that you see terms used in 1940s America that we wouldn't use today. And I mean no offense by using that. It's just part of history. Now, if you want something that's a little more colorful and appealing to the eye, then you have the theme of V for Victory. The whole idea of using the V for Victory symbol, which Winston Churchill made famous by doing this in his photographs, was actually an idea came up by the Belgian Minister of Defense, and then it was sort of copied by the BBC, who then added Beethoven's Fifth Symphony to it to sort of make a musical tribute to the idea of we're in this hall until we get to victory. But you see V for Victory then appearing on the United States items as well when we entered the war, and on everything. If they could print victory on it, they did. You see the wax paper on the top corner becomes, instead of just simply wax paper, it's now the victory pack of wax paper. The salt and shakers are now victory salt and shakers. The meat cookbook that's in the top corner on the right, it's now the victory meat extender cookbook. Because of rationing, you wanted to extend your meat with other products. You see the stamps there, pins, the large ladies brooch in the top corner. Boy, if they could put victory on it, they certainly did. One curious item I want to point out for those that are maybe collectors of civil rights items is that double victory symbol in the bottom right corner. The Pittsburgh Courier newspaper, which was an African-American newspaper out of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, came up with this double victory campaign. And these items are tough to find, but the idea was to have victory overseas in the war, but also victory at home in achieving civil rights. Victory items were very popular to wear during the war. You see on this screen in the top left, some of the victory pinback buttons that were made. And on the bottom right, some of the victory pins worn predominantly by ladies during the war. Very popular items, and I think they make a great display because they're often colorful in red, white, and blue, or come with some sort of gemstones or rhinestones if you're going with the ladies' ones on the bottom right. A pro tip I always like to joke about, one of the items they like to make during the war were victory vases. I have about 6 of these, but my wife is such a good soul. She goes with me to all these collector shows, and she never says a word about me collecting history artifacts. In fact, her thought is, if you're going to have a hobby, why not have it related to your career and your passion? So I always appreciate that, but I try to make sure that there are flowers in my victory vase that's in the kitchen or in the dining room as a tribute to her, and her being a wonderful wife and supporting what I like to do with collecting these items. When it comes to postcards, you really can't find more patriotic images when you throw that V on there, like this postcard scene here. I just love the military imagery around the outside of different World War II era weapons, but also the Statue of Liberty and that large V that's in the middle. Very colorful and very popular, and these are not that hard to find. My marquee item, and I just think this one's fantastic too, is this little ukulele. It was actually a gift that you were awarded from the Paradise Seed Company in Pennsylvania. Now, how would you achieve this ukulele? By selling 24 packs of seeds. Seeds for what, you may ask? Well, that brings us to our next topic, and that is victory gardens. During the war, it was estimated that 2/3 of all Americans had a victory garden. In fact, it got so bad, they had to advise people, you don't really live somewhere that the soil is good for having a victory garden. They had to tell people to stop wasting seeds because there was a 300% increase in demand for seeds. In fact, you see on the screen there, they started to, just like on the other page, market things with victory. They started to market seeds as victory garden seeds. They're still the same seeds, but add that patriotic appeal to it. The county that I live in, which has about 40,000 homesteads, had about 30,000 victory gardens during the war. So again, about 75% of the people in my county at one point in time or other had a victory garden. That was to make up for the fact that you couldn't buy too many canned vegetables. So there was a lot of encouragement for people to go home and plant those items and can them during the winter so you have them. And you see here some pins of people. They even had victory garden contests. You see the sign on the bottom left. They put them in public areas, in town squares, any place where you could plant a victory garden, they were willing to do that. It was also a popular activity, I might add, for school children. See, the item in the middle is targeted to school children. That's a poster. My postcard I picked for this selection, depending on how you look at this one, might be a little bit of risque humor. It's my victory garden. This postcard is from 1943. And depending on how you read that last word, from a busy old hoer, or if you use the old English pronunciation of that, you're talking about a busy old, well, I'll just let you fill in the word there. But that's a maybe one that is a little more adult humor. But, you know, in time of war, people still need to have a respite from the stress and all the fears and concerns they had about the war, and maybe have a laugh once in a while. My marquee item here again is Disney. Disney was heavily involved in the war effort. And you see here a victory garden sign. These are greatly reproduced. So if you see one made of metal, avoid that. The original were made of a cardboard wood-like combination. So if you see this in metal, that's not an original. It's obviously because it's a Disney-made item. It's very popular, and they do appear every so often. But avoid those metal versions. Civilian defense and the Aircraft Warning Service is another area of collecting for homefront collectors. You see in the center of the screen there all the different jobs that one might acquire through the civilian defense program, whether it's being an air raid warden, the person that went around the neighborhood advising folks to turn out their lights, that the enemy airplanes were on their way, or those that would help with fixing the roads and fixing buildings after the airplanes had come, or putting out fires. Those involved with turning off utilities, folks that were trained in first aid, folks that were trained in chemical warfare, to provide food and water for those that were helping out with civilian defense. There were a lot of jobs involved there, and it was a way for folks to participate really in the war effort, but at home. There was also the organization, the AWS, that's the Aircraft Warning Service, and they were looking for civilian volunteers that would sit on watchtowers. We had one where I'm from that was on the town hall on the top. We had one outside of town also, where they were manned 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for folks that would come and volunteer and look for the enemy airplanes. And people took this job very seriously. A couple examples of that in Texas, one air raid warden noticed a neighbor's porch light was flickering on and off. He thought, well, that's going to send a message to a German submarine off the coast. So what did he do? He tried calling his neighbor. Neighbor didn't answer. So he got out his rifle, went out and shot his neighbor's porch light out. Another fella had signed up the entire volunteer fire department in a small Georgia community. They were having an air raid drill, and the firefighters were at their positions, and they were told, take this serious. So when the fire alarm went off, no one responded. The house burnt to the ground, but they maintained their post for civilian defense. So people really took this seriously. And even in California, on a sad note, outside of San Francisco, they were worried about the Japanese invading the West Coast. So they set up some roadblocks manned by civilian defense workers. And a woman got confused, ran the roadblock, and they actually shot her. Now, she didn't die, fortunately. But again, that gives you an idea of how serious this was. And one of my favorite items is on the bottom left there. That's a blackout kit. And the blackout kit really epitomizes what people were willing to go to by shutting out all their lights and then putting little glow-in-the-dark symbols on everything in the house so they could be protected against the attack by enemy airplanes, which fortunately never came. So by the end of the war years, 1944 and 45, they took and mobilized all these folks that were involved in civilian defense and said, you know what, we're going to use you to sell war bonds instead. So you see in the bottom center of the screen, you see now you have a bond warden instead of an air raid warden. And on the bottom right, you have a poster there advocating for people to donate clothing and things like that for the war effort, also carried out by the Civilian Defense Organization. One thing, if you're looking for these items, you want to keep in mind, and that's the difference in terminology. Civilian defense is World War II. Civil defense is the Cold War era organization. So if you see an item that says civil defense, that's not a World War II item. And that's one way I know people actually collect these items only, that's an important distinction between the two. The postcard I selected for this group is from Portis hats, and this is another example. And by 1945, there was a little backlash against this. This is an example of using the war to promote your company. And on the back of this postcard, notice it has the symbols around the outside. And I'm going to flip back to the other screen, see the symbols that are on the left and right margins of the postcard. If I go back to this screen, they're using the symbols of the Civilian Defense Organization. On the back of the card, it says the best dressed defense workers wear Portis hats. So a little combination there, but I always thought that was a neat little postcard to go with that group. My spotlight item is an air raid warden siren, and I really enjoyed taking this into school. Teachers that didn't know I had it would always have that first reaction of they'd hear a large siren down the hall and maybe call the main office, and usually the office would say, well, are you near Jim Lowe's room? And they'd say yes. And like, maybe check in his room. It's probably Jim with his air raid warden siren. That one's a hand crank siren, by the way, that the air raid wardens would carry around. I will note also, if you find one of these, it's kind of fun to play with, unless you have a cat. My cat, whose name is Teddy Roosevelt, by the way, but my cat is terrified by it, which made me almost want to change his name, because you can't name an animal for a brave president and then have him run and hide when you put on an air raid siren. But just a fun little story I like to share about that, and another neat artifact you can add. Patriotics. Boy, this is a catch-all category. There's a lot of different items that fall into this category of objects that were made during the war to promote the war effort. Whether it's the license plate topper that says keep him flying, or the button that says keep him firing, or reminding us that the Nazis were burning books, or the arcade game that you could drop pennies in to try and win a war bond, or the hat, even that box in the top left corner, which allows you to reuse your coffee grounds to make a second, third, and fourth cup of coffee. You could be patriotic by using that. There's so many different items in this area, and I think it's a very popular area, especially for those that don't want to maybe focus on items to promote buying war bonds or items involved in rationing. Plus, they're usually very colorful. A lot of different items in this category. Some favorites of mine here: the U.S. Navy Relief Badge in the top left there. A good story that goes with that: Joe Louis, who famously joined the Army during World War II. In his last prize fight before entering the Army, he donated his entire money that he made from that fight to the U.S. Naval Relief, and they provided money to sailors that came home that were injured or families that had lost loved ones. He donated $90,000 from that fight to Naval Relief before he joined the Army. I should point out that the U.S. government, in appreciation for that, taxed him on that $90,000. Also, in the area of patriotics, you have some items in the middle there. Very popular. Leaders were viewed as the heroes today. Now, we know today the real heroes are the men that were in the foxholes and flying the airplanes and in the submarines. But back then, people really admired the generals, although I would make an exception to that role for General Jonathan Wainwright, seen in the poster that's in the middle there, who spent over 3 years as a prisoner of the Japanese. He was the one that surrendered the Philippine Islands to Japan after MacArthur was ordered to leave and go to Australia. An interesting item, I think, is on the top right there. That is a pocket card for diabetics. You know, really tough time for diabetics with sugar rationing. If you have low blood sugar, what do you do if sorry, we don't have any sugar right now because of sugar rationing? People were only allowed 5 pounds of sugar a month, and that was a special concern for diabetics. The last item on the screen, I think a great story, is the program Dogs for Defense. That's that little silver plate in the bottom corner of the screen, and that would sit in the palm of your hand. It's not very big, but that's what was given to folks who actually donated a dog to the U.S. government. Now, if you love your dog, well, you might be thinking, well, how do you donate your dog to the government? Well, you sign him over to the government with their word that he will come back if possible. And not every dog made it home. In fact, 300 of the 18,000 dogs that were donated did not come home to their owners. Some of them were killed in action, including 24 dogs that were killed in the Pacific Theater. But most of them came home. They used the dogs for 3 different tasks as patrol dogs. Those were dogs that would be used at home to patrol the beaches and shorelines by the Coast Guard, for example. Those dogs had to be on a leash. Dogs that were better trained that didn't need to be on a leash were also used as dogs for roving patrols. And then finally, there were dogs sent with military units that were the aggressive dogs, German Shepherds, Doberman Pinschers, dogs like that. The government took any dog as long as they weighed 50 pounds and were 18 inches tall, except Chow Chows. They were not cooperative to the training. After the dogs went through training, it was then decided if they passed the training, which one of those 3 groups they'd be assigned to. And it was a very successful program, but obviously some heartbreak for the 300 families of dogs that didn't make it home. My favorite dog story was a dog named Chips. Chips was involved in the invasion of Italy and was with his handler when they came up on a fortified position. Machine gun opens fire. All the soldiers hit the deck except Chips. Chips made a beeline straight for the Italian position, charged up over the barricade into the position, and got one of the Italian gunners by the throat and dragged him outside by the throat. The other Italians then surrendered. Chips was actually awarded a decoration for bravery, but then the government decided, no, we're not going to give decorations to dogs. But he did meet President Eisenhower to give him that commendation. And of course, the best part of the story is he bit Eisenhower, which I'm sure provided a lot of laughs for the folks that were observing that particular ceremony. But I think that the Dogs for Defense program is a wonderful part of the story of the war. And there's a lot of stories of very heroic dogs other than Chips during the war. And there's some books written about that. My postcard from this, and again, I come from a railroad city, and I'm a big fan of railroad items. So this is a Pennsylvania Railroad postcard, and that's a Dean Cornwell illustration who did a lot of their very famous calendars during the war. And in this particular image, I think it's a great combination of the military imagery and then the train below. This postcard was actually sent to PRR workers who had joined the military in a care package free address, and they would send this back home and say, thank you for sending me the care package. My feature item here is made by Seagram's, and that's one that nearly everyone will recognize. That idea from my image at the beginning of the slideshow of shut up and keep your mouth shut, loose lips might sink ships. Probably one of the most iconic images from the war. Another popular area of collectible was sun and service items. And really, I could do a whole presentation on sun and service items and sweetheart jewelry. There are really limitless examples of that, but I'm going to focus on sun and service. These are the items that are typically red rectangles in most cases with a blue star. Each blue star represents having someone in your family in the military. So moms and girlfriends and dads and aunts and uncles and neighbors, boy, everyone was just proud to have someone they could support in the military, and they would hang these up or wear the pins on their clothing, or maybe put a picture frame like the one on the bottom in their house with a picture of their loved one in the center of it. Now, you'll notice that some of the stars are a little different. The red star that's on the banner that's on the left indicates someone in that family was a prisoner of war. The silver star on the one near the center of the screen indicates that that family member was actually wounded in action. And the saddest one of the group are the gold stars. Gold stars indicated that family had a loved one killed in action. And an organization was created called the Gold Star Mothers to help support those families. One other fascinating item here that I'm going to point out to you is in the bottom right of the screen. That's a pin made of leather. As I indicated before, there's a lot of substitution materials during the war because of wartime shortages. Here's the postcard I selected for this particular group. This is from the Home Folks to Servicemen series. And this one is sort of a comic of a wife and her husband there, and she's giving him the business with a sun and service banner hanging in the back. This series includes ones that have jokes about collecting scrap materials, and there's one where the husband and wife are riding a bicycle saying that we're conserving gas, and sort of a neat series that, again, is not too hard to find. My spotlight item here, if you like these types of collectibles from the home front, there are some very large banners that were made for churches, schools, businesses, fraternal groups that showed how many members they had in the military. And I think these are just fantastic. And, you know, this is one area I never sell my duplicates. I have many sun and service pins. A lot of them look the same, but I treasure them all because I know the person wearing that was hoping and praying every day for their loved one to come home. So I think these items are just so special. For those that are political collectors, there are a lot of FDR items made during this time. Roosevelt was president for most of the war. You know, he was first elected in 1932 and reelected in 36 and 40. Once again in 44. He died in 1945, just before the end of the war. But there was a lot of items that were made for FDR during the war, whether you see the posters that are here, you see items that also have other Allied leaders known as the Big Three. You see Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin there pictured with Roosevelt. Again, talking about wartime shortages, that red, white, and blue button that's in the center of the screen is actually made of cardboard. But again, if you're a political collector, these would be items that would appeal to you. My postcard I selected for this group is a French-made postcard. This was made after France was liberated by the Allies. And as the Americans crossed the Rhine River, this is celebrating the Rhine River, but it shows Franklin Roosevelt giving a spanking to Adolf Hitler. So we're getting into the idea of those anti-Axis collectibles, which also matches this one. This is a little wooden figurine that you can move back and forth. And as you move it back and forth, the hammers come up and down. Winston Churchill and FDR then pound on the head of the enemy leaders. One side has the Japanese leader, and on the other side, it has Adolf Hitler. Speaking of anti-Axis items, the imagery of the Japanese leaders were typically non-specific to a person. The Americans typically viewed all the Japanese as the enemy, where when it came to the Germans and Italians, we focused primarily on either Adolf Hitler or Benito Mussolini. My last area of collectibles in this presentation and the focus of the book I talked about back at the beginning is anti-Axis propaganda. And I divided that into two categories. First, the ones that kind of make fun of the enemy, whether it's the poster in the middle that shows cartoon-like images, or the bowling pins to take out your frustration, or the ashtray in the bottom right, where you can put your ashes right in Hitler's mouth, or some of the pins, the magic trick that's in the bottom left, where you put the enemy leaders in coffins and they're weighted, so you can be the genius and hold up the little coffin, depending on which way you feel the weight balancing. You would know which one it is. You can press people with your magic trick, or simply that banner on the screen, to hell with Hitler. There was a lot of ways people like to take out their frustration on the enemy, as seen by the images on this particular page. But let's be serious about anti-Axis propaganda. There were a lot of important messages about the Axis that were not intended to be comic. And that's what I have on the second page here. The Axis did a lot of things that were war crimes. They were responsible for starting the war, their mistreatment of prisoners, as seen on that poster that's in the bottom right side of the screen, the treatment of French workers being enslaved in the middle, the poster in the bottom left that shows the Nazi hand stabbing the Bible, the magazine in the top right, which documents the early mistreatment of Jewish citizens throughout European nations, and the magazine in the top left, which documents efforts made by spies inside the United States. There are a lot of reasons why anti-Axis propaganda was necessary to remind us this was why we were fighting. It was not all the comic imagery that's on the previous screen. But as I mentioned before, sometimes if I go back to this, people needed a laugh, like that comic figure of Hitler seen in the top right there, or the guillotine, where you could mock cutting the enemy leaders' heads off. There was time for that, but there was also time to remind folks that the Axis truly was evil, and this is what we're fighting for. The postcard I picked here is from a classic series of 8 cards from 1942. I'm not sure to pronounce the artist that did these, whether that's Bernardier or Bernadier. Not sure, maybe somebody will tell me if I mispronounce that. But I think this is a fantastic art series. These are particularly difficult to find from this series of 8, but I think they did a great job with the artwork on this. And again, a lot of these anti-Axis items you see with themes that relate to the others. This is a theme related to American production, but also has that unflattering image of a Japanese soldier there. And again, I want to mention that's not something that we found acceptable today, but we have to look at that through the lens of history. My marquee item here in my last section is of the famous Adolf Hitler pincushion. The Nazi pincushion. Franklin Roosevelt had one of these on his desk, and it became very popular because of that. And next to it is the rare example. It's pretty easy to find the smaller versions that were sold in stores and giveaways at fairs and things like that. But the large one is the display version that they had in stores where they sold these. Those are particularly difficult to find. When I get to the end here, why do I spend time collecting all of these? In addition to the point I made at the beginning when I taught history for those 34 years, I like to use artifacts. I like to have history be hands-on and show students something they can actually hold and look at and observe and discuss. And I had that for just about every subject. And I was fortunate that I taught modern American history, basically 20th century, that I could assemble these items. But I think this postcard really epitomizes why I collect home front items. It reminds us what those on the home front went through. Because we know, honestly, it's the men on the front lines and the submarines and on the aircraft carriers and battleships and flying the bombers and fighters and the Marines going ashore on Pacific Islands that actually won the war. But they couldn't have done it without the folks at home. And this postcard epitomizes that. On the front of the card is the message of buying war bonds. On the back of the card is a message from Violet to her friend Agnes, checking in on her to see if she's okay. She had heard she was not feeling well, but Violet also mentions that her son, her youngest son, her baby boy, as she calls him, is missing in action, and she's just crazy with worry. And that, to me, I think really epitomizes the sacrifice by those on the home front, and why I think this is just a special period where everyone was pitching in, regardless of age, from people that were 100 years old to the youngest of children had those ration books. They were buying war bonds. They were participating in scrap drives. They were doing everything they can to win the war. And that's why I think this is such a fantastic area to collect. One final plug for my book, because I think people will find this fascinating. Here are the 24 categories I have in my book of anti-axis collectible items. The book is available only in paperback now. I've actually sold out of my hardback copies. So all I have left is paperback, and they are $35 plus shipping. The email address is there. I think everyone will find the book enjoyable. So with that, thank you for joining me, and I hope you learned something today about the home front.